Hello, students. My name is Calvin Ko, and I will be your instructor for your big picture view of American history course. Now, our first lesson will simply be an introduction to the course itself, what to expect from my lessons, as well as what to expect from AP U.S. history as a whole. Now, just as a brief introduction about me, I majored in history in university, and currently I'm a teacher for various different subjects, whether that is history courses, AP history, IB history, as well as ACT, and one of the things that I do for most of my time is college admissions. And as such, I'm going to be looking at history also kind of as holistically, how it fits in to your overall academic journey into university. Now, the first thing I want to discuss is why study U.S. history and why study APUSH. It's a course that I think many students find very intimidating. A lot of the things that I've heard from my students is that, what do we do in history, right? It's useless. What am I going to actually do with this? And how about if I actually fail this course? Because it's certainly something that can really penalize you if you're not really putting the work into your preparation for the exam. Well, firstly is first, it aids in college admissions. I told you that one of the things that I do for half of the year essentially is work with students, work with seniors on college admissions. And United States history is a very, very valuable course in that it's a course of rigor. What rigor means is that it's considered a very difficult course by universities, particularly in America. And if you can do well in the course, we're not asking generally for an A+ in everything, right? Even if you can do well and hold your own in the course or get a 4, get a 5 in history, it means a lot to these universities that you were able to take this hard course and you were able to do the work and do the preparation for it. It's by design what the exam is, right? There is a multiple choice section, but there is a very extensive writing component to this exam, which is, in a way, that part of the exam doesn't lie, right? If you do well on the writing part, they know you can go to university and write an essay in history, in English, a science report, right? They know that you have the language skills to do so. So when we look at AP courses in general, I oftentimes tell students that there's a tier list, particularly in humanities. I'm not going to speak of the science subjects, but with humanities, when you talk about the hardest courses, it's usually AP Literature and AP United States History. Very difficult, requires a lot of hard work. Right under that, you're going to get things like world. I'm not saying world history by itself is a very easy topic, but the way it's designed as an AP course, it's not as bad. This is why many students take AP World History in their 10th grade year at school, as well as courses like English language, AP English language, right? As well as things like Gov, which in many ways is a more specialized version, American government, specialized version of AP United States history. But the reason why AP United States history is so difficult is that it's so comprehensive. You're not only talking about politics, you're talking about literature, you're talking about economics. The hardest part, you're talking about religion, right? American religion, which always causes my students a lot of problems. But if you have the ambitions to go to a top 10, top 20 school in America, particularly, I don't like saying this all the time, particularly if you're Asian, right? Because Asians tend to not want to take U.S. history. A lot of Americans do. But a lot of Asians stay away and just take the science course. But if you have these ambitions, I think this is a course that you do need to take, right? To really diversify your academic history, your academic portfolio in a way to offer these universities. Because doing well in this course tells admissions officers a lot of things, right? Number one, that you're hardworking. Number two, that you have the intellectual capacity to really deal with a hard topic like U.S. history. And number 3, that you have the necessary skills, right? Things like reading and writing. The reading in history is quite it's quite infamous, right? It can be very difficult because they're bringing in a lot of primary resources. So if you can handle the sources, whether that's the DBQ, whether that's the multiple choice, and then do the writing as well, which is 3 to 4 pages, universities will welcome that. They like that. I think the second kind of benefit of taking AP United States history is that it addresses a lot of the reading requirements on other exams. Many of you are probably either currently or planning to take things like SAT and ACT. Well, I think the current version of the SAT, it's a little less emphasized, right? The history component of the reading. But when you see previous versions of the SAT, let's just take, for example, the 1600 paper version that existed. There was an entire passage on the reading section that was a history passage, right? And why learning history is very important. And number 1, if you don't have the necessary skills to read the old passages that come out generally on a history passage, then what you can always combat that with is background knowledge, right? You might not know these old words, antiquated words that we don't know, but you have the concepts. You can read the sourcing and know that, this guy, Benjamin Franklin, believed in this. Therefore, most likely, this passage is about this. It allows you to take the shortcuts that you need. Now, with the ACT, obviously, they're considering changes as well in the near future, but there are history passages. And at times, it can be quite difficult. If you don't know how to contextualize what you're reading, you can't skim, right? Which is one part of the ACT reading because they don't give enough time for students to actually read everything very closely. So it gives you those tools to skim, to take those shortcuts that you need to do well on these exams. It will also help you with other courses as well, certainly. If you want to take AP U.S. history, AP American government is easy. Right? Generally speaking, a lot of students take AP government in their 12th grade year after doing AP U.S. history in their junior year as an 11th grader. It's basically a free AP course because AP U.S. is so much harder. Economics, it'll give you the base. Maybe it might not teach you how to read a graph, a very complex graph, but it'll teach you the concepts of things like fiscal policy, things like tariffs, terminology that you normally use in an economics class. Aside from, the college entry as well as the help that it gives to, other courses at school, it facilitates an English language acquisition. I know this does not apply to everybody, but certainly learning AP U.S. history is going to raise your vocabulary level, right? History is not easy to read. There's a lot of big words. You got to read court cases. You got to read laws, right? You got to hear politicians speaking, right? They're not going to use simple language all the time. And as such, it will help you with things like with your vocabulary. The writing is very big, right? The writing on AP, many people say, is the hardest part of the exam, right? You're going to be expected, particularly on the second part of the exam, to write 6 pages by hand, right? And certainly by developing that skill, it's going to help you with a lot of other things that you need to do in high school. Maybe writing a college application essay, for example. And ultimately, it helps with academics and life in the United States. Some of you may have lived in the United States. For those of you who haven't, learning U.S. history is going to help you understand why the U.S. is what it is, right? There's a lot of, for example, political polarization in the United States. If you go there, you're going to understand why people think this way and why certain people believe in one thing and why other people believe in another thing, right? And it'll help you find out where your peers come from, right? If they come from the Midwest, they think a certain way. Or if they come from California, they think another. This is what history is going to allow you to do. Now, the course plan for the 29 videos that we have for this particular big picture view of U.S. history will consist of focusing on critical historical patterns, people, and terms. This is more of a lighter version of U.S. history. I'm not going to go into too much in detail of the concepts and tell a lot of stories that led to particular events occurring. But what I will be doing is there will be terms that will be bolded in gold or that will be put in gold. These are terms that you absolutely need to know in preparation for either your AP U.S. history exam or maybe even your regular U.S. history class at school. I think one of the advantages of learning U.S. history is that the concepts are the same, regardless of what history that you take. A lot of times an AP U.S. history course will teach you the same materials that you need in a 9th grade U.S. history course, in a middle school U.S. history course. The only difference is the detail, right? How deep you decide to go into something. Like, for example, if I go through a court case in this big picture view of history, I'm not going to tell you all of the events that led to that court case. I'll probably tell you what the court case was, how it started, and how it ended, right? The decision that was made. But certainly, there's always context to everything. And normally that context, for more detailed views of history is needed for things like the document-based question or the LEQ, where they give you 1 or 2 extra points for being able to look at a particular issue with a lot of detail. Each lesson will end with 2 review questions. They're review questions that are inspired from previous versions of AP U.S. history exams as well as the old SAT subject tests, but they will help you kind of at least check whether you've actually understood what has been covered in a particular lesson. And I think this is very important. Good note-taking and repetition is key to doing well in history. I think a lot of students, where it all goes wrong is that they watch a video once and they expect to memorize everything. People who are very good at history they will read a book multiple times. They will watch videos multiple times and they will have their own notes. I have my own notes that is only for me. I always give it to my students, but they never understand what I write down because I wrote it in a way that I understand the particular concept. So make sure that you have a document open or a notebook in hand and start writing in your own language how you have understood a particular concept or whatnot. Now, looking at the AP U.S. history exam itself, it's a 3-hour, 15-minute exam. I'm certainly going to go into this in a lot more detail in more detailed views of U.S. history. It essentially has 4 assignments, right? They say 2 sections for break reasons and whatnot, but there are 4 parts to this exam. There's the multiple choice exam, the short answer questions, the document-based essay, and the long essay question. And you see the breakdown of the score. One thing I always tell students, because a lot of students like ignoring the essay portion of this exam, that 40% is going to determine whether you get a 3, 4, or 5 on this exam. Because I've seen people do multiple choice very well, but because they don't want to practice the essay writing, they absolutely tank the essay and the score goes down. And of course, it's graded out of 5, like any other AP exam. Now, talking about the score itself, a 5 is great. If you can get a 5 on an exam, fantastic, right? But if you get a 4, it's not actually horrible for AP U.S. history simply because of the rigor that is involved with the course itself. I always tell people, if you're going to go into things like history or political science, sure, getting a 5 in AP U.S. history is great. But if you're going to major in other majors such as a science, like you're going to be a chemist or you're going to go to math, getting a 4 is okay as well. Of course, a 5 is very obtainable because it's about 80%. If you can get 80% on the exam, you get a 5 on this exam. But it's very hard to obtain. Now, I'm going to give you kind of visuals of what the exam looks like. This is the multiple choice section. They give you a reading passage. You're being asked to answer 2 to 4 questions per reading question. Some of it is reading. Some of it is using your background information. It's kind of half and half in that sense. This is a short answer question, a more complex version of a short answer question. What you are expected to do is essentially write 3 sentences for each question here. So if you have question 3, A, B, C, you're going to be writing approximately 9 sentences to answer that particular question. You're going to be doing 9 of these altogether. So doing the math, you're going to be writing about 25 to 30 sentences in your short answer portion of the exam. This is your document-based question. Essentially, they're going to give you 7 documents. Document 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You're going to be reading those documents and you're going to be using the content of those documents to make an argument. For this particular question, what they ask is compare and contrast views of United States overseas expansion in the 19th and 20th century. Evaluate how understandings of national identity at the time shaped these views. Sure, you can bring in your own information, but this is essentially a reading exam and a research paper exam. Can you do research based on the 7 documents that I give you? This has to be approximately 3 pages of handwritten essay, right? And there is a very strict rubric that they go by. And then finally, the long essay question, there is no documents. You're going to be asked to answer a question based on background information. So this is where having a lot of background does help, right? And they will usually give you 3 choices for questions, and you're going to pick one of those questions that you want to answer. And approximately you need to write 2 pages for that particular response. Now, looking at the AP U.S. history units as a whole, the AP U.S. history is divided into 9 units, each section having kind of an estimated portion that they take up in an exam. Now, I know a lot of students, they'll look at 5% for Unit 9 and believe that they shouldn't be studying as much for Unit 9. It's a very dangerous approach because you never know, right? If you get lucky, or I suppose unlucky, and get a short answer question that deals with the 1990s and 2000s, you're a little bit of a pickle if you don't actually, if you didn't do any type of preparation. So I always tell students, don't think about the proportions. Just memorize everything to the best of your ability. If you don't, my motto is, if you don't want to study something, then study it. That's what you should be studying, because that's obviously something you feel very uncomfortable about. Now, Unit 1 will talk about Native American societies before arrival and the founding of the New World. We're talking about Spanish colonies in the Americas, the Renaissance, Columbus, the conquistadors, etc. Unit 2 talks about British colonization of the Americas, so the 13 colonies, as well as some of the colonial and societal changes that happened during this time. Unit 3 very much is about the American Revolution and then what kind of government the U.S. made. The constitutional government, the Articles of Confederation, etc., etc. 4, 5, and 6 is talking mostly about the 1800s. Okay? So 4 is about the first half of the United States, political parties, the first industrial revolution. The middle part, Unit 5, will be the Civil War and its effects. Unit 6 is the back half of the 19th century. So the Gilded Age, conservatism, Westward movement, and those kinds of topics. And then finally going to Unit 7, 8, and 9, this is mostly talking about the 1900s, right? Unit 7 will talk about imperialism and World War I, World War II, the Roaring '20s, the Great Depression. This is probably the most dramatic, right, period in U.S. history. There's a lot of detail that you need to be able to absorb in Unit 7. Unit 8 is the Cold War, right? Everything that happens during the Cold War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the hippie movement of the 60s and 70s, etc. And then Unit 9 essentially talks about the post-Cold War era. We're talking about Bill Clinton. We're talking about 9/11. I always say color television, right, is Unit 8 and Unit 9. Okay, so this is kind of a summary of the units that you will be learning. So hopefully you guys have a great experience with the big picture view of United States history. Do not be intimidated by the course, make the proper preparations, plan out how you want to prepare for this particular big picture view of AP U.S. history, and you will have taken your first very important steps in doing well on the exam as well as your coursework at school. Hello, students. This is going to be our first class for our Big Picture U.S. History lecture series. And for our first class, we're going to go through the pre-colonial period from 1491 to 1607. This particular unit, or at least this particular lesson, is part of Unit 1 in your APUSH units. And generally speaking, it's going to be one of your smaller lessons when it comes to your APUSH preparations. Now, to begin with, I want to ask the question why we actually study this period. In particular, we're not talking too much about American colonists. A lot of times we're talking about Spanish colonialization, as well as developments in Europe from the 15th to the early 17th century. So first, the significance of the dates is that 1491 was the last year that a lot of Native American groups were able to survive as independent entities. It was the last time they ever had any freedom or were able to enjoy their way of life. 1607 represents the date that the Virginia Company ended up landing in Jamestown and kind of starting off this wave of British colonization. So what we are talking about essentially here is everything that happened within those 100 or so years. We are also going to talk about a lot of Europe's cultural, social, and political changes and transformations during the period. As some of you may know, Europe was going through this period of enlightenment as well as religious transformations such as the Protestant Reformation. So it's very important for us to at least be aware of what was happening in Europe and literally what caused Europeans to actually come to this faraway land during these centuries. We will also have some discussion about the Spanish experience in the New World, as the Spanish in many ways set many precedences in terms of economic practices and social and cultural norms that would be followed by many future colonizers in the New World. And finally, we'll talk about the establishment of intercontinental exchange between the New World and the Old World during this period. Now, to begin with, we want to talk about Europe during the 15th to 17th century. As I had mentioned, it was a period of cultural, social, and political upheaval in Europe. Europe was kind of coming off the end of the medieval era, the high Middle Ages in the 14th and 15th century. And because of movements such as the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, people had a very different understanding of how the world worked. Now, starting with the Renaissance is a rebirth of classical culture, meaning in history, it means all the culture that was developed from 600 BCE to 600 CE, which included civilizations such as the Roman Empire, the Greek civilizations at the time, as well as Hellenistic cultures that were developed by Alexander the Great. We saw religion undergo great transformation, something that we will talk about in future slides with the Protestant Reformation. We saw the introduction of new economic ideas, such as laissez-faire economics, which is kind of this precursor to free market economics and capitalism, as well as mercantilism, which was the economic system that ran many which kind of defined the relationship between mother countries and colonies at the time. We also saw the introduction of the Enlightenment period, which was a logic-driven intellectual movement in Europe. And as such, there were these huge advancements in areas such as science and politics. Science in terms of our knowledge of astronomy or navigation and cartography. And of course, in politics, which emphasized the importance of representative governance and natural rights and democratic values as a whole, which would define many of the colonies, especially in the New World. Now, beginning with the Protestant Reformation, as this was probably the most important of the movements, it was sparked by Martin Luther's publication of the 95 Thesis. And what this was Martin Luther, who was this German monk, part of the Catholic Church at the time, had many issues with some of the practices that were adopted by the Catholic Church, particularly when it came to things like indulgences, as well as final rites, which were rights given to dying people, which would ensure a person went to heaven, essentially, and the Catholic Church was receiving some form of financial compensation for this. And it created many socio-political divisions in Europe based on religion. Specifically, we saw many of the Central European countries, your Germanys, or at least the German city-states at the time, the Netherlands, and Switzerland actually adopt many of these Protestant values, which was, of course, the off-branch of Martin Luther's publication. We also saw in England the formation of the Anglican Church of England, which essentially was a church that was created so that Henry VIII could have a second wife. He ended up having several wives after, but because the Catholic Church was very firm on the sanctity of marriage and particularly a European monarch having only one wife, he figured, okay, this was one way for me to at least divorce my current wife, right, and to have future wives. And in particular in England, what you saw was this hodgepodge of religious denominations and sects, right? You had the Anglican Church of England, which was something that was adopted by the King of England and as well as the Parliament. You had, Catholic, pro-Catholic populations, right, which would come later during the Stuart dynasty in England, as well as a very sizable Protestant population that took on the form of Puritanism in England at the time. The Catholic Church did not remain firm, right? They understood the threat that these Protestant movements, these Anglican movements had in the popularity of their own denomination, and therefore they underwent something called the Counter-Reformation to at least combat the spread of these two kind of breakaway denominations in Europe. This included things like the Spanish Inquisition, which was essentially the persecution of non-Catholic peoples in Europe, as well as the creation of the Jesuit class, right, which were these Catholic missionaries that would go all around the world to spread the tenets of Roman Catholicism. And you saw this huge proliferation of Christian sects as well as denominations in Europe, which in many ways alienated many of these groups and caused many of these people to find opportunity elsewhere, particularly in the New World. And in our next slide, what we see here is kind of a visual representation of at least the proliferation of Christian denominations at this time. We see kind of the early denominations of Christianity, your Orthodox and your Roman Catholics, who ended up splitting in the 11th century due to the separation of the Roman Empire. And then, of course, later on, the formation of Anglicanism as well as Protestantism during the Protestant Reformation. Now, going into our discussion about the Age of Exploration, the reason why this occurred was because of some of the political and social situations at the time. Many of the luxury goods, at least globally, existed in Asia, mainly in places like India, China, and Southeast Asia. The problem was that because of the rise of empires such as the Ottoman Empire, as well as the other Muslim empires in the Middle East, in South Asia, it was very difficult for Europeans to go through traditional routes through land. So for them, it was very natural for them to find some sort of waterway that would bring them to India, that would bring them to China to at least obtain these luxuries. Hello, students. This is our 6th lesson on our big picture view of AP United States history. We will now move on to the Constitution, which covers the time period 1786 to 91, and discuss why this particular form of government, was introduced to the American public following the Articles of Confederation. Now, the question I want to ask is what led to the Constitution? And there are many factors to this. We had discussed in our previous lesson how the Articles of Confederation, at least the first form of centralized government by the United States, had many weaknesses, whether that was a lack of power in the central government or the lack of jurisdiction and oversight over particular issues. And as such, the Constitution provided a solution to many of these problems that had broken out, particularly in the 1780s. We also saw a culmination of problems relating to expansion, economics, and foreign threats. The issues had become a lot more complex than I think the founders or of the Articles of Confederation would have ever predicted. And as such, you needed a more robust government to deal with these more complex problems. There was also a desire for America to strengthen itself. And the way to do that was through a stronger central government, which had more oversight and which had more power to not only strengthen themselves economically, but also politically vis-a-vis foreign countries like Britain and France. Now, there are many events that led to the Constitution itself. The first meeting occurred in 1786 through something referred to as the Annapolis Convention. And what this was 5 states who had some disagreements over trading policies amongst their 5 states, decided to meet and discuss at least this particular issue. And this issue had kind of transformed into a larger conversation of what kind of changes could be made in the central government to at least facilitate this kind of trade among states. And this all led, of course, to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, where you had more attendees, right? Initially you had 5, now I believe there was 9 or 10, right? And then eventually leading to the inclusion of all 13 states coming to this convention held in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Now, there were, of course, people who did not agree with the strengthening of the central government. And the biggest gripe that they had with this strengthening was that they did not want in any ways to mimic what they had experienced under British colonial rule. The problem for many of these colonists was that there was a king who was making all these decisions on behalf of his subjects, right? And this had created a lot of the problems. They were the anti-federalists who opposed many of these changes. And what this how you see this is looking at the people who were absent in this meeting. Thomas Jefferson himself, I wouldn't say was an anti-federalist, but he is someone that was suspicious of the strengthening of the central government. And it kind of led him joining a political faction referred to as the Democratic Republicans once the constitutional government was formed. A stronger critic would have probably been Patrick Henry, who believed that having this strong form of government would actually increase the level of tyranny that you had. But really outside of those two, as well as other anti-federalists, we had a lot of the founding fathers actually attending this meeting, whether that was George Washington, whether that was Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the Constitution can be a very complex issue, right? There's an entire AP subject dedicated to it, AP U.S. government, that is dedicated to just looking at the American government and how it works. But what I do in this slide is kind of put the Constitution for you in a nutshell. I'll go into detail in future slides. But what the Constitution was the formation of a federal government. What a federal government is a collection of parts, a collection of states into one government with clear separation of powers in different branches inside the government, as well as a separation of powers between the federal government and the state government, right? In other words, what you're saying here is that there are certain things that the executive branch can do, and there are certain things that the legislative branch can do. There are certain things that the federal government can do, and there are certain things that the state government can do. So they're clearly drawing the lines in what each branch can actually do and their jurisdiction. There were 3 branches of government with delegated powers, right? They were asked to do certain things, and they were heavily regulated by checks and balances. So the reason why 3 branches of governments were created was, number one, it hoped to address some of the issues with the early Articles of Confederation, particularly with things like the enforcement of law and the interpretation of law. But what they also wanted to do was they wanted to overcomplicate the government. It was actually premeditated to overcomplicate how the government worked so that one branch didn't get too strong, right? If you were a president that was wishing to have have a lot of power, right? The 2 other branches, the judicial branch and the legislative branch, can do things to you, right? To make sure that you don't gain too much power, at least during your term, okay? There was also an amending process in the Constitution, a far easier than what existed with the Articles, right? You remember with the Articles, you needed all 13 states, 13 members to vote for an amendment. Well, in the Constitution, it doesn't happen very often, but it only required 2/3 of a legislator, right, to want to amend a particular part of the Constitution. And of course, you had expanded jurisdiction, right? One of the other big issues with the Articles was that there were certain things that the central government couldn't touch, right? Things like taxes and whatnot. Through things like the necessary and proper clause, which is referred to as the elastic clause, what this allowed Congress to do was that Congress was allowed to touch on issues that were not specifically stated inside the Constitution, right? It would become a point of controversy, I think, later on with different political factions, but at least theoretically, it gave the central government a lot more space and a lot more power to touch upon a lot of different issues. Now, introducing the 3 branches of government, okay, this is kind of the very basic skeleton of how the federal government works. We have the executive branch, and the executive branch's job is to execute the laws that have already been passed by the legislator, right? And the reason why this is possible in America is that the President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief of the United States military, right? He can use the military as a tool to make sure that people around the country are following the laws, right? The president is also elected through something called the Electoral College system, which I will describe a little later. It's a very weird system where a president is not elected on popular vote, right, but is elected on basically how many states decide to vote for you. We also see cabinet members being appointed by the president who are not elected by the people, who are appointed to help the president in specific policy making and whatnot. So positions like Secretary of State or Secretary of Treasury are examples of members of the president's cabinet. We also have the legislative branch, which of course is the branch that makes all the laws in the United States. And different from the Articles of Confederation, we now have something called a bicameral legislature, where we have two branches of government. Right, in the Articles, we had one branch consisting of 13 members. Now we have two branches, the upper house being the Senate and the lower house being referred to as the House of Representatives. We will discuss this a little later. This was created because there was disagreement among states on how the legislature should be structured. We finally have the judicial branch. Hello, students. This lesson will be our 10th lesson in our big picture view of AP United States history. And in this lesson, we're going to cover Jacksonian democracy, which spanned from 1824 to 1840, and which is included in Unit 4 of the AP U.S. history curriculum. Now, what is Jacksonian democracy? In our last lesson, we talked about America after the War of 1812 and some of the benefits that they had started to experience because of the end of the war. But we're now entering into a period of important developments, but also a lot of chaos within the political and social environment in the United States. So there are four things that essentially happened during these 2 or so decades. The first is the expansion of political participation and suffrage to most white males. And the reason why this was important was until this time, it was at least understood that you needed to be affluent. You needed to have property to be able to participate in politics. By having more people get involved in the political process, we started to see a lot of shifts in terms of political support, as well as the type of issues that people started to really feel, that it was very important for them. The second development is the emphasis on welfare on the common man, not limited to affluent individuals. And of course, this is an extension of the expanded political participation we saw amongst poor peoples, particularly your farmers, maybe even your middle-class merchants. It was a period defined by rampant sectionalism. I had mentioned in our previous lesson that when a country does experience a little bit of stability, when there is a lack of an external threat, what starts to happen is that people start to try to find enemies within, right? You start to have problems with your friends because you have nobody to hate, right? That is British, that is French, that is Spanish. At least during this period. And we start to see people separate themselves along social, cultural, and even political lines. And finally, during particularly the presidency of Andrew Jackson, we saw a huge change in the political environment, as Andrew Jackson had in many ways defied many of the governmental norms that had been established before his presidency. Now, what I want to get into is Andrew Jackson's introduction to politics. Andrew Jackson is probably a face that you guys have all seen, right? It's a face that you see on the on the American dollar and whatnot. So Andrew Jackson became this very important political candidate due to some of the accomplishments that he had during the War of 1812. So very similar to George Washington in a sense. But he had lost his first election in a very controversial manner. In the election of 1824, John Quincy Adams, who was a Democratic Republican, became president after a very tight race between him and Jackson. Essentially what had happened was that the electoral colleges of both candidates was exactly the same. And at least at the time, by American law, if you have a tie in electoral college, the Speaker of the House gets to cast the final vote in terms of who will become president in the country. Well, Andrew Jackson had won the popular vote, so it would have made a lot of sense for the Speaker of the House at the time, who was Henry Clay, to have voted for Andrew Jackson to be the President of the United States. But what had occurred was that John Quincy Adams, prior to the vote, had spoken to Henry Clay and had promised him a cabinet job, essentially, for his vote. And this whole episode is referred to as the corrupt bargain. And it's an incident that Jackson made sure that the voters did not forget about. So understanding that he would run in the next election, he went around America telling everybody that he had essentially been screwed of the presidency in 1824. So he promised to expand political participation. He appealed particularly to poor regions, right? You're talking about the Southerners, you're talking about the Westerners, who in many ways, I think, sympathize with a lot of the issues and a lot of the circumstances that Andrew Jackson had himself experienced in 1824. And it led to him becoming president in the next election, in the election of 1828. Now, Andrew Jackson's presidency from 1829 to 37 is defined by three very key developments, okay? First things first, Andrew Jackson became your first Democrat. We started to see a little bit of political fragmentation within the political body. We talked about how the Federalist Party had disintegrated due to the Hartford Convention in the War of 1812. Well, now what you are seeing here is within the party itself, you start to see 2 to 3 different groups. Just because of Jackson's, in a way, very, very strong personality, but also some of the issues he held dear. So the first development was the passing of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And what this law entailed was that all Native American groups would be pushed to west of the Mississippi River. And I have a map here to kind of visualize what had happened. There were some remaining Native American groups. Many of them, of course, were kicked out of the eastern seaboard during the colonization period and whatnot. You know, the Wampanoags, the Powhatans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you had, groups such as the Seminoles and the Cherokees and the Miami group up here in the Midwest. And what this law did was essentially force these groups to go on to something called Indian Territory west of the Mississippi. This is referred to, of course, as a reservation, a system that we still continue to have in America today. And what had happened was that a Cherokee group had decided to bring this to the courts, right? Obviously, there is a lack of fairness in all of this, right? This is Native American land, and they were essentially being forced off their land by the federal government. And the discussion of the legality of this particular measure happened during a court case in Worcester versus Georgia in 1832. And what had happened, interestingly, was that the Supreme Court, led by John Marshall, repealed the law, saying that this law was illegal. So the Cherokees did have an ally in the Supreme Court. Now, one thing you're going to learn about Andrew Jackson was that this guy really doesn't care, right, what you think. So what he decided to do was he decided to bring his American military into the South, into places like Georgia, and forcefully kick out the Cherokee Native American group to the Indian reservations west of the Mississippi. And this is referred to as the Trail of Tears, partly due to the injustice of the actual expulsion itself, but also because of the casualties that had occurred during this long walk into the native reservations. The second incident is referred to as the bank wars. Now, Andrew Jackson is a Democratic Republican Democrat, right? But he's also a very extreme Democrat in that he very much opposed the rechartering of the Bank of the United States. Now, the situation here is that because the bank is not afforded, it's not something that is mentioned in the Constitution, the Bank of the United States is something that needs to continually receive a charter, right? So the first bank was passed after 20, 30 years. They need to pass another charter here. And there were people within the Congress, right, who wanted to pass this particular rechartering of the bank. This included probably old Federalists, right, who were big government people who supported the original bus, but also some Dem reps, right? Thomas Jefferson himself wasn't opposed. Hello, students. This will be our 13th lesson on our big picture view of AP United States history. And in this lesson, we're going to cover the Civil War that spanned from 1861 to 1865. And it is included in Unit 5 of your AP U.S. history curriculum. In our last lesson, we talked about a lot of the tension that had led up to kind of animosity between northern states and southern states. What that all culminated into was the breakout of the Civil War in 1861 to 65. Now, looking at the Civil War in a nutshell, I think there was like 2 to 3 different causes that caused the Civil War. The first being that there was a lot of lingering problems pertaining to slavery, sectionalism, and economic disparity. The discussion had always taken place. It really started in the Constitution, and it continued on into the 1830s, 1840s with debates like, the Haynes debate, and even a compromise in 1850. But that had all boiled it had all gone to a kind of a boiling point where everybody was getting angry with each other. And the election of Republican President Abraham Lincoln was kind of the last straw for many of these southern states because they perceived this man as a man that would actually try to push for change with regards to the spread of slavery. The war itself was defined by 2 things. One, the South unity. Confederate states, generally speaking, as a whole, felt that the North was encroaching into some of their economic freedoms and their civil rights in a way by banning slavery, while the North was essentially defined by its superior manpower, its manufacturing capabilities, as well as its resources. Eventually, once the war ended, this would lead to quite a prolonged discussion about the future of the South and what they would do with freed slaves once the Union had won the war. Now, looking at the early years of Abraham Lincoln, when he first came into office during his debates with Stephen Douglas, he had made his intentions very clear with regards to, number one, slavery as a free soiler. He didn't want to see the spread of slavery. And number 2, the hypothetical situation if the South was ever to secede from the Union. And he did so by giving this very important speech, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." Essentially what he's saying is, I don't care what the Constitution says, I don't care what the compact theory is or the reserves powers clause. If you guys secede, I am going to take steps to make sure that I reunify this country, whether that is peaceful or in this case, in the Civil War's case, violent. And he appealed to the idea of perpetual union, which essentially is opposite of the compact theory. We had talked about the compact theory both with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions passed by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. We had also talked about the compact theory during the nullification crisis, where states have this right to examine a federal law to determine the constitutionality of a federal law, and if so, to reject that law if they feel it encroaches on the rights of the states. Well, what he's saying is here, what Lincoln was saying is the moment that you guys join the Union, you're with the Union forever, right? There's no justification, there's no reason that you can give ever to break away from the Union. So he was talking about the illegality of breaking away from the country. So the moment that President Lincoln was elected as president, we saw the first tier of states seceding from the Union. There was about, I believe, 7 states or so. It was 7 states who broke away from the Union knowing that they couldn't live under this future of Abraham Lincoln. It was led by President Jefferson Davis from its first capital, Montgomery, Alabama. And if you take a look at kind of the style of the Confederate States of America, it was more like the Articles of Confederation, a loose confederation of states where individual states in the South would have a lot of power and a lot of say on how they wanted their state to be run. Now, violence began in Fort Sumter, South Carolina in 1861. There was a pocket of resistance in South Carolina of Union loyalists, right? There were soldiers who wanted to fight for the Union in a southern state, South Carolina, which was the first of the first tier secessions. And so what Lincoln decided to do was he decided to send his Navy. He decided to send ships to supply these Union forces in South Carolina. Jefferson Davis, feeling that Lincoln had violated sovereignty, national sovereignty, as he made his own country, decided that he would bomb Fort Sumter. And it essentially started the violence that we would see in the Civil War. Now, before we get into discussions of specific battles, what I want to discuss are some of the advantages that each side has. When it comes to the Union, the North, they had a massive industrial advantage. This kind of stems from the American system that was proposed by Henry Clay during the era of good feelings. We talked about how the North would be kind of the manufacturing center, the manufacturing hub of the United States, and the West and the South would be the resource feeding, the agricultural areas of the U.S. Well, naturally, over many years, you had a lot of factories in the North who could make industrial products, who can make weapons, right, that can be used in war. They had better infrastructure. If you take a look at the transportation revolution, there was a map that I had shown in a previous lesson whereby most of the railroads and most of the roads in the country were located in the North, which allows for better logistics, right? Goods can be moved from one area to another more quickly. And finally, there was more food in the North, and there was more money in the North. Now, a lot of you may ask yourself, wait a minute, aren't the southern states known for food? Well, you got to think about what the South was actually growing, right? They were growing cash crops mainly. Tobacco, which is something you cannot eat. Things like cotton, you cannot eat, right? So there was certainly a shortage of foodstuffs in the South during the war. With the Confederates, they had 2 very big advantages. Number one being there was a greater union amongst its citizens, right? Generally speaking, most people in the South agreed that the secession was the right thing to do. Okay? And number 2, it just happened to be that many of the generals that were in the United States before secession were Southern generals. We're primarily talking about 2 generals here, Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. The Northern generals were highly inexperienced, some of them, and some of them midway through the war actually ended up getting, discharged, right, by the president because of their poor performances in early battles. Now, if you take a look at the map of Union and Confederate states, we see that up top here, we have a lot of free states in the South, the red. we got the two tiers of slave states, which we'll talk about in a future slide. And then the sky blue states here, we're talking about Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware. These are what we refer to as the border states, right? States that eventually would join the Union despite being slave states themselves. Now, developments during the war itself. Lincoln secured the border states, as mentioned in our previous slide. Those 5 states. And he did so by carefully navigating the slave question. Remember, there was evidence to show that Lincoln himself was an abolitionist. And yet, during the election, he decided to take the free soil stance, right? Allowing states that already had slavery to keep slavery, but stopping the spread of slavery into the territories. This would certainly, for more moderate states like your Missouris, like your Marylands, right, be something that they were willing to accept. He also, when he passed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, hello students, this is going to be our 19th lesson in our big picture view of AP United States history. And in this lesson, we are going to cover the Progressive Era from 1900 to 1920. And this is part of Unit 7 in your AP U.S. history curriculum. So what was the Progressive Era? Simply put, it was a period of change pertaining to issues of politics and business. What we had talked about in our previous lesson is how during the Gilded Age, we did see some sort of economic growth in the United States, immense economic growth, but as a byproduct, we also saw the emergence of various social and political issues, whether that was the emergence of labor unions, whether that was agrarian discontent, or even political corruption. What the Progressive Era did was try to address these issues through the passing and implementation of legislation by, luckily enough for the United States, reform-minded politicians, right? You need the leadership in the United States to allow such legislation to be passed and to be properly implemented. We also saw the emergence of various social movements as well, mainly pertaining to suffrage and the civil rights movement, which became kind of a bigger deal as court cases such as Plessy versus Ferguson, as well as issues such as segregation, became kind of a big issue in the United States. Now, the foundations of the Progressive Era is largely founded on certain Gilded Age movements, mainly the social gospel, which consisted of many people in city-dwelling middle-class citizens. And some of you may remember that the social gospel was this very church-oriented movement whereby Christians, right, believed that one of their duties as a Christian was to help the unfortunate segment of the population. We also saw many ideas stem from the populist movement, the Populist Party, which was, of course, the Farmers' Party, as well as the emerging socialist movement. They proposed ideas such as the graduated income tax or direct senatorial elections, which ultimately became a reality during the Progressive Age. Like I had mentioned, there was political support as well. Again, you can't pass these laws when a president is unwilling, right, to really support the passing of these laws. And strangely enough, we had two Republicans here, Theodore Roosevelt and William Taft, at least during the first 12 years of the 20th century, who were willing and who actually encouraged the passing of such legislation. And then, of course, it all culminates with Woodrow Wilson, who is a Democrat and who is naturally going to be very reform-minded, right? As Democrats generally get their support from the middle or lower ends of society. Now, one of the new kind of phenomenons that emerged from the progressive era was the muckraker movement. Now, muckrakers is a term given to investigative journalists who are very prominent during the progressive era. We already had talked about one of those journalists, Jacob Riis, who some of you may remember was the individual who talked about tenement housing in the cities, especially with the influx of European immigration. We also had individuals such as Upton Sinclair, who wrote a very famous book called The Jungle. Long story short, what this book was it was basically calling out the national meat industry, meatpacking industry in Chicago. There was a lot of corruption in the processing of meat in Chicago, whereby different chemicals would be used, people would be sold rotten meat, expired meat, and he called people out on this in a novel. And what this ultimately led to was the passing of a couple of very important legislation in the United States, mainly the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 and the Meat Inspection Act, both of which became kind of the precursors to the Food and Drug Administration we have today, the FDA, the organization that checks like new medicines or makes sure that new products are safe for public consumption. There were other books and other essays as well. Ida Tarbell wrote essentially an essay on the history of the Standard Oil Company, which played a very large role in breaking that monopoly up. It's something that I had mentioned in a previous lesson, how this company had essentially taken all the global oil companies under one umbrella. She called them out on that. The Octopus by Frank Norris talked about the power that railroads had in kind of dictating to farmers and dictating to the American economy as a whole with their price fixing and whatnot. And there was a couple of very important publications that became kind of the home for many of the muckrakers, mainly McClure's magazine. So if you ever see an exam and you see a picture of McClure's, you probably know that it's a very reform-minded magazine, as well as Harper's Weekly. And what I have here on the board are two examples. On the first, we see a kind of a picture from McClure's saying, Tammany Hall, this is our funeral. It's a criticism, of course, of political machines. And then on the right, one of the covers of McClure's magazine, whereby you see authors like Lincoln Steffens, who is another muckraking artist who used to call out things like political corruption and some of the various issues that used to exist in cities such as New York. Now, moving on to reform relating to labor and women. The progressive era from 1900 to 1920 saw the passing of many amendments, constitutional amendments. 3 to be exact that are very related to kind of progressive thought. The first was the graduated income tax with the 16th Amendment. And what this essentially did was that it made people who made more money pay higher percentage of tax, whereas people who made less money, a smaller percentage of tax. And the point of this, of course, was to distribute, more equally distribute wealth in the United States. This was something that was proposed by the Populist Party and eventually came into reality during the Progressive Age. Direct senatorial elections is there to hold senators accountable to their constituency. Originally, senators were not elected by the people of their state. They were elected by their state legislators, according to the Constitution. This would make sure that senators who went to Washington would be responsible in basically becoming the voice of the people of their state. And then finally, women's suffrage with the 19th Amendment that was passed in 1920. All 3 were considered very progressive, at least for the time. Now, there was a very important event that kind of caused a lot of discussion regarding labor reform, and that was a fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. This was kind of early on in the 1900s. And essentially, it really ask the question about kind of safety and the working conditions that you see in the United States. So the first law that kind of relates to this event was the passing, or at least the court case of Mueller versus Oregon in 1908. This limited work hours to 10-hour work weeks, right? It is something that we do see in certain countries, right? Some countries saying 35-hour work weeks maximum, while others say 50. But ultimately, what they're saying here is don't overwork your workers, right? There shouldn't be a 14 to 15-hour workday, right? That's crazy, right? For people to experience. The Keating-Owen Child Labor Act in 1960 ultimately banned child labor, right? Which was, of course, a very, very important step. They were a little late to the party, as many other countries. I believe Britain had already banned child labor in the 1890s or so. So America passed their own law saying that children could not be working, particularly in very dangerous environments, like a factory environment. Women's suffrage was also something. Hello, students. This will be our 24th lesson in our big picture view of AP United States history. And in this lesson, we're going to talk about the origins of the Cold War, which kind of started from 1945 after World War II. And if you talk about the Cold War in general, all the way up to the early 1990s. And this is part of Unit 8 of your AP U.S. history curriculum. Now, what led to the Cold War, and what is the Cold War? They refer to the Cold War as cold because it involved the underlying tensions between two emerging emerged superpowers in the United States and the Soviet Union after World War II. And it encompassed all aspects of society, whether that was political, military, and economic rivalry. It was also kind of facilitated and fueled by the instability caused by independence movements around the world. And essentially, the U.S. and the Soviet Union trying to find friends and trying to find allies to expand their spheres of influence around the world. And there was multiple proxy conflicts as well as hot wars around the world. Essentially, the Soviets and the U.S. never fought each other. They ended up using their client states or their allies in order to have their ideological battle. Now, what led to the escalation of tensions? Europe and essentially Berlin were separated into spheres of influence after World War II. The way World War II worked was that the Soviet Union had essentially occupied everything east of Berlin, right, at the end of World War II. And then you had American and Free France and U.S. forces kind of occupying everything west from Germany after World War II. And the Soviets were in many ways they had a lot of paranoia in thinking that they needed to establish some sort of security to buffer any type of future attacks from the West, because they understood that the alliance itself was an alliance of convenience. It's not that these particularly Western countries liked the Soviet Union, right? They needed the Soviet Union to defeat Nazi Germany. And because the Soviet Union was afraid, they decided, hey, we're going to kind of split Europe into two. And at least very early on, especially during the Yalta Conference, what Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, had promised was that he would give elections to these Eastern countries, to these Eastern European countries, to allow them to choose what kind of system that they wanted. Did they want a more democratic systems that were run by Western countries, or did they want a more communist-oriented economy, right, run by the Soviet Union? Well, he broke that promise. He never ended up giving those elections. And what it essentially created were Soviet satellite states, blocs, or what Winston Churchill very famously referred to as the Iron Curtain. Essentially, that imaginary line that goes through Europe that separates Soviet-influenced Europe and then kind of NATO, capitalist, democratic Europe. You also saw the formation of the United Nations in 1945, primarily to try to avoid some of the large-scale conflicts that had taken place in World War I and World War II. Now, the U.S. kind of realizing that the Soviets were going to be a problem after World War II, decided to pass something called the Truman Doctrine, founding their idea on this idea of containment. The idea was here that George Kennan, a very famous guy, I believe he was the Secretary of State for the United States, essentially said here that the Soviets or communism is like a disease. It's going to spread. And it's the American it's our responsibility as Americans to make sure that communism doesn't spread throughout Europe. And so the way they were going to do this was through something called the Marshall Plan. Fundamentally, what the Marshall Plan is to provide financial support to European countries so that they could rebuild their infrastructure and rebuild their economies after World War II. What the U.S. realized was that communism was especially rife in countries that were facing economic problems. And so by giving economic support, not only would they be able to rebuild these economies and make them not so susceptible to communist movements, but also would influence other countries in Europe to kind of follow along and adopt that kind of system. And the main recipients of the Marshall Plan was West Germany, Turkey, and Greece, which ultimately led to a lot of the incidents that broke out in Berlin, particularly in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So East Berlin, which was controlled by the Soviet Union, many people from East Berlin started to move to West Berlin, mainly because they saw that West Berlin was a lot more advanced than East Berlin because of Marshall Plan aid. Well, the Soviets, knowing that this was going to be some sort of propaganda loss, decided that, hey, we're going to blockade Berlin so that people can't move, that American goods cannot go into Berlin, and that goods from other parts of Europe can't go into West Berlin. And this led to something called Operation Vittles, or sometimes referred to as the Berlin airdrop. What the Americans decided to do was they decided to fly planes of supplies and goods into West Berlin to in many ways support the city in their fighting against this blockade. Now, ultimately that blockade was broken, but this is the reason why the Soviet Union and East Germany decided to build a wall between East Berlin and West Berlin so that people couldn't cross from one part of the city to the other. So that was in many ways a symbol of the Cold War, at least in Germany up until the late 1980s. What you also started to see was the formation of collective security through alliances. Now, what collective security is kind of this idea of alliances that if one country in my alliance gets attacked, then other members of the alliance are responsible for helping that alliance member. And this was done so mainly through two organizations in Europe. The first is something that we still have today, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, which consists of countries like the U.S., Britain, France, West Germany, Canada, and they would kind of come together to protect themselves from Soviet aggression. And then in the East, you had the Warsaw Pact, which included all of the Soviet satellite countries and other communist countries in Eastern Europe, with the exception of Yugoslavia, which was it's a story of its own. And then you also had a version of this in East Asia as well, as the war kind of crept into Asia with the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. And what had kind of been created out of all of this was an arms race and nuclear proliferation. The Soviet Union essentially learned how to make a nuclear bomb, and the Soviets and then Western countries, which included the U.S., France, and Britain, they decided to develop and increase their nuclear arsenal, which created a very uncomfortable situation in the world, thereby creating something called mutually assured destruction, or the MAD theory. The idea that the more nuclear bombs there are in the world, the safer the world is, because one misstep would lead to the end of the world. So you didn't want to be responsible for that. I don't know, it's kind of a twisted logic to me, but that's how the world ran in the Cold War. You also saw the space race, particularly between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a country that many Western countries didn't believe have the technological know-how to be so advanced and to be such a strong country. They hadn't really demonstrated that for many centuries. And now for the first time, you start to see the Soviet Union not only develop a nuclear bomb, they were the first to send a man-made device to space through Sputnik. And they actually ended up sending their first cosmonaut, right, Yuri Gagarin, to space. And this led to the U.S. establishing NASA, which eventually